To be denounced before 8 in the morning interferes with the digestion. Gerald, unable to swallow his cereal, wondered what he'd done.
"Shame on you,"
chanted the lone protester outside. Much as Gerald searched his memory for past disgraces, nothing wicked came to mind. Disappointing, really. By one's mid-40s, oughtn't a man to be ashamed of something? He strode the length of his townhouse, upstairs, past the back terrace, across the living room, beyond the guest and master bedrooms, up to the top-floor study, which still smelled of paint 3 weeks after they'd moved in. At the window, he peeped down onto the street. The protester, a pudgy, bearded man, stood there holding a sign that declared, "Filthy pig," followed by 3 exclamation points. Gerald turned from the window, glancing at the attic clutter. What had he to be ashamed of? After all, much of Gerald's adult life had been devoted to charitable works. 83 non-profits entrusted him with a total of $1.6 billion, which it was his duty to protect and increase at Wisset Brown, the private bank whose charities department he directed. He returned to the window. 3 more demonstrators had joined the bearded man, who raised a megaphone for a new chant, words of loathing that seeped into Gerald's consciousness with utmost relief. This rally, he realised, was aimed at his neighbours. When he'd first contemplated buying this house, Gerald noticed on the adjacent property a rain-dirtied flag with an exotic yellow bird at its centre, marking the embassy of a nation he thereafter referred to as the Kingdom of Budgerigar, one of those tiny states he knew to be brutish and hot, but whose location on a map required 2 minutes to find. He'd contemplated whether the act of residing beside a despicable regime raised moral questions, particularly for his partner, who was at the Foreign Office. But, as a friend had commented, if Britain were willing to accept diplomats from Budgerigar, surely Gerald should be broad-minded enough to live next to them in South Kensington. Plus, the house was extremely reasonable. Thankfully, the Budgerigarian diplomats proved a genial bunch, particularly a charge d'affaires called Ustafa, who invited them to dinner with the ambassador soon after their arrival. Gerald's only lingering complaint was that they put out their rubbish so much earlier than the council demanded, causing an awful stink given that fish featured so highly in the national diet. As he stood in his attic, the protest chant outside took hold of him. "Go away, you fat goats, or we choke you by your throats." The temptation was to lean out and remark that a throat was the only place one could choke a goat, wasn't it? Though, to be fair, they needed a rhyme with goats, and he couldn't think of a better one. Gerald avoided eye contact with the demonstrators when he left for work that morning, biking off for Wisset Brown. A satisfactory day ensued, including a luncheon with his 4th largest charity, some of whose fundraisers had been pushing for a shift to so-called ethical investments. That is, no oil companies, no big tobacco, no orangutan abusers. Gerald cautioned that he had yet to encounter a socially responsible investment that performed long-term. You could set out with ideals, and indeed should, but you could not achieve ideals with ideals. The head of the charity was relieved. Times were tough without taking a risk on their holdings. The financial crisis had led to a decline in giving and a rise in neediness. Anyway, the existing investments would stand. As the luncheon concluded, the head of the charity made a few conscience-salving comments, remarking that Gerald had forced our hand and been so hard-nosed as ever. Untrue and unfair.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?